So now that you're starting to learn your way around Android Studio, we're going to dive a little deeper and see how we can create a button, and more importantly, we're going to see how we can write a little bit of code to do something when the user taps that button. Okay, so creating the button itself is pretty straightforward. We tap on the button widget here in this list and just drag it in, and I'm really not worried about layout or anything here, so I'm just going to drag it to the center there. And you can see we've got the default title, new button, and then we've got all the properties that we've had before. It's all as we would expect, so we can change the style, the look, the layout in exactly the same way that we have before. I'm just going to do a very basic change just to show you that it works in the same way. So go to background as we saw last time, and I'll choose color, and we'll have a nice sort of turquoise button. There we go. So we've changed the background color of our button there. And just to see what that does by default without us having to change any code, we'll quickly run the app as it is now, just so that we can see how that button responds to a tap by default. So if I jump over to my emulator, there it is, my new button. Doesn't look great, but that doesn't really matter at this point. So I can tap it and you might be able to see just a tiny response there. There we go. So you can see that we've got a little bit of interaction, but obviously nothing's actually happening within our app because we haven't set that up yet. Okay. Now there are a number of ways to get a response to tapping a button. I'm going to show you the most simple way of doing it right now because we're just getting started, and we'll see some other ways to do it, possibly better ways to do it later on in the course. So we're going to jump over to a new file, and this is, if you haven't got it open, in Java, and then it'll be your first Android app, that folder there, and then it will be called main activity. And double click on that and you'll be able to see this lovely chunk of code here. Yours might be slightly different if you're using a different version of Android Studio, or if you picked a different template when we started making the app, but overall it'll look roughly like this. Now at this point, obviously I don't expect you to understand every word that's written here. We're just going to have a quick look through what each of these chunks of code are doing, but bear in mind we'll spend a lot of time on this later on, and that's not really the purpose of this particular video. We just want to get an overview of what's going on here and then know enough to be able to get our button to do something. So first of all, at the very top, we've got the package that we've created. So that's what we entered when we created the app in the first place, so that's fairly straightforward. And then here we've got a number of frameworks that we've imported. And they've all been imported by default, of course, because we haven't added any ourselves yet. And they're just imports that allow us to use a bunch of methods. And then if we want to use the methods that aren't included in these defaults, then we'll add those ourselves, as we will in a minute. So if you're familiar with iOS development, you'll be very familiar with this, although you're probably used to fewer import statements on your average app. And then here we've got our code that runs on the app itself. So again, we'll look at this in much more detail in the next chapter when we go into Java and how it works. But essentially, we've got our main activity class here, which is the chunk of code that controls essentially what the app does. And the bit that we're particularly interested in is this onCreate method here, because this code will run when the app itself runs. So a lot of the code that we write will be in here, and it will run just when the app has completed its setup and loaded and is ready to do something for the user. These other methods down here are specific to the app type that I chose, which had a menu at the top. So these are just methods that control the menu itself. So we're not going to look into what these do at all at this point, and don't worry about them if they look confused and terrifying. They probably will do now, but in just a few videos time they'll be second nature, so don't worry. All we're going to do is create a function that will control what we want to do when the button is tapped. And what I want to do is just save a bit of text to the logs, which will show us that the button has indeed been tapped and that something's happened. So to create a function in Java, we start by defining the scope of the function, which in this case is public. So it's accessible by any other method or function within the app. So again, don't worry too much about what scope is exactly. All we're doing is defining our function, and we're saying that this can be accessed from anywhere in the app. Next, we use the word void, which again is another complicated sounding word, but all it means is that our function is not going to return anything. So if something calls this function, it shouldn't expect anything back. You could imagine a function that, say, doubles an integer, and that would return an integer, which would give response. But we're not doing that here. We're not returning anything. We're just going to display something on the logs. So our method is void. It doesn't return anything. Now we choose the name of our function. So I'm going to call it click function for obvious reasons. Notice the capitalization there. Normally we use a lowercase c for the first word, and then we capitalize all the other words after that whenever we're creating method or indeed variables. Okay, so stay with me. This function is going to be called when the button is tapped. So it's going to be essentially called by the button, and the button is of a type view. So the object which is going to call it is a view. So it's going to receive that variable view, and we'll call it just view. So again, don't worry too much about this. All that's going on is it's being called by a button, and this gets ready to accept the object that's called it, which will be a view. And then we use curly brackets, and you can see we've got an open curly bracket, and it automatically created a closed curly bracket for me there. And then the code that we want to happen when the button is tapped goes inside these two curly brackets. And as I say, all we want to do is to put something in the logs, and we do that using the command log with a capital L. And then there are a few different ways that we can add something to the logs. We can use I, D, E, and there's various other ones as well. I'm going to use I for information because we want to display some information to the logs. We don't want to display an error, for example. In fact, if we are displaying something to the logs, that means that something's gone right. So I'm going to use log.I to display some information to the logs. And then I'm going to put just something like info as the title of my log. And then the content of the log is going to be button tapped, exclamation mark, and then semicolon at the end there. So again, there's a lot of new stuff there, but hopefully that all makes sense. We want log because we want to put something in the logs, .I because it's going to be some information, and then the title is just info. You could put whatever you like there between the double quotes, and then the sort of real content of the log is button tapped, and again that's between quotes, and then you just close brackets and semicolon to end the command. Right, you'll be pleased to know that's all the code that we're going to type, except you'll notice here we've got a problem. So this view is inside, can't make it pop up now, there we go, and it's inside android.view.view. And so this message is telling us that we need to import android.view.view to be able to use this. So all we need to do is type import and then exactly what we're missing. So android.view, there it is. We can use the prediction to save us having to type it, and then capital V this time, view, there it is. Enter again to predict, and then semicolon. And that's got rid of that error for us. So now whenever this click function is called, it's going to display button tapped on the logs. So you might be wondering, how am I going to cause this function to be called when I've actually tapped the button? Well, again, there are a number of ways to do it. The simplest way, which we're going to do for now, is to go back over to activity main.xml, which we could either do by double tapping here, or because we've already got it open, we can just switch back to it. And then click on our button, and then scroll down to onClick. And this onClick essentially allows us to type in the name of a function that we want to happen when the button is tapped. Simple as that. So I'm just going to type click function. There we go. So now when we tap that button, it should run the code over in main activity.java, which will display the information on the logs. So the main thing not to worry about too much is exactly what this code is doing. So I've explained the level of understanding that I would expect you to have at this point. Feel free to Google some of these words if you want to get a bit more information. But to be honest, I don't think you need that now to get a bigger overview of how apps are made, as we'll do in the next few videos. And then we'll dive much deeper into Java and we'll find out exactly what's going on with all these publics, voids, class, extends, and everything else. All right, let's just check that that works then. So let's run that. And with any luck, we'll find that when we tap the button, we now get button tapped in the logs. So let's just open up our phone. Here we go. So new button again, tap that, and there it is. Fabulous. So you should be very excited about that. I certainly am. That's your first actual bit of code that hopefully you've written if you've been writing along that has made your app interactive. So that's our first interactive app with a button that does something on response. So a lot of new stuff there. I'm going to give you a challenge to give you an opportunity just to practice that. So I want you to create an app from scratch which has a single button, and then I want you to change the text on that button so it says click me, and then when you tap it I want you to save to the logs hello and then whatever your name is. So very similar to what we've done, just to give you an opportunity to type all this out for yourself. Feel free to look back at what we've done here, but if you can do it completely from memory, all the better. All right, best of luck. Pause the video now. I hope you managed that. I'm just going to run that through for you. So right from scratch, we're going to create a new project. So file, new project. And then I'm going to call it button example. Here we go, and tap next, everything else the default, and we'll have a blank activity. Just not to confuse anything, and we'll keep all that the default as well. Here we go, so it's creating everything for me. Lovely. So that's all now ready to go. Let's click over to the design view. So it's rendering our app for us. There we go. So there's our hello world. I'm just going to leave that there. And then I'm going to take a button, drag it in. Again, not worried about layout at all. So the first instruction was to change the text on the button. So let's just double click on the button. And we want the checks to be click me. There we go. And while we're here, in fact, to save me coming back and doing it later, I'm going to change on click to, this time I'll call the method button clicked. Enter. There we go. So that's all I need to do over in activity main.xml. We've set up the app. Now we just need to write the Java to execute this button clicked. Here we go. So you can see we've got the imports. They're just abbreviated there because you don't normally need to worry about them. And let's import our view first of all so we don't get that nasty error. So import android.view.view. There we go. And then it's inside the main activity class. So inside here, and then we use public to make it accessible from anywhere, void because it's not returning anything, and then button clicked was the name that I used. And remember, it accepts a variable of type view, which we're going to call view with a lowercase v. So exactly the same as before. And then we've got our curly brackets to contain the code that we want to run when the button is tapped, or indeed clicked, depending on whether you're running it on a simulator or a real device. And then just as before, we use log with a capital L dot I, and then I'll use the same as before as my title, so info, and then hello Rob, semicolon. There we go. And one thing there, I wonder if you managed to spot that, we're missing the logs by default here. It was included last time, but it's not this time. So let's just pop that in. So it's android.util.log. So import android.util.log. There it is. Fantastic. So now we should just be able to run that, and we'll find that we just have our single button, and then when we tap it, with any luck, it'll say hello. Here we go. So it's asking us to choose our emulator. In fact, no, let's just choose the running device. We don't need to open a new one, and if I tick that box, that'll save me having to select that every time. So okay, and then jump over to our emulator, and in a moment that should pop up with our new app. Here it is. Fantastic. So click me, click, and there we go. Hello Rob. Fantastic. So I hope you managed to do that, and I hope that's given you a little bit of insight into how the activity main.xml file connects with the actual Java, which controls the logic and functioning of the app. Fantastic. So I hope that went well for you. In the next video, we're going to see how we can create a text field for the user to enter information and then access that information using our button clicked method. See you there.